Judge Harold Whitman strode into the Manhattan federal courthouse ready to put Jasmine Crockett in her place, but just minutes later, his gavel would fall silent as her legal brilliance left him speechless. What happened in that courtroom would become the stuff of legal legend. The imposing granite steps of the Southern District Courthouse glistened with November rain as media crews jostled for position that dreary Thursday morning. Camera operators wiped droplets from their lenses while reporters huddled under umbrellas, their breath visible in the crisp air. Today's hearing had drawn national attention, not just because it involved entertainment icon Whoopi Goldberg's defamation lawsuit against a major media conglomerate, but because Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had taken the unusual step of personally representing Goldberg, her longtime friend and mentor. Inside Courtroom 318, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations as journalists, legal observers, and curious citizens filled every available seat. At the plaintiff's table, Whoopi Goldberg sat with quiet dignity, her expression serene despite the gravity of the situation. Beside her, Jasmine Crockett reviewed her notes one final time, her movements precise and deliberate. Judge Harold Whitman swept into the courtroom at precisely 10 a.m., his black robes billowing behind him like thunderclouds. At 64, he embodied the archetype of judicial authority, silver-haired, sharp-featured, with pale blue eyes that seemed to dissect everything they surveyed. His thin lips rarely curved into anything resembling warmth, and today they were pressed into their familiar line of disapproval. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice echoing through the wood-paneled chamber. As the court settled, Judge Whitman's gaze lingered on Jasmine Crockett with unmistakable disdain. Before anyone could speak, his voice cut through the air like a scalpel. "Miss Crockett, I see you're representing the plaintiff today. I must confess, I'm surprised. A sitting member of Congress playing attorney? One wonders if this is a publicity stunt or a serious legal proceeding." Crockett rose smoothly, her posture perfect, her voice clear and unwavering. "Good morning, Your Honor. I am admitted to practice in this court and am fully prepared to represent my client's interests." Whitman's eyebrows arched skeptically. "Indeed? Well, let's hope your performance today is more substantive than the political theater we've grown accustomed to from Washington." He shuffled papers on his bench, not bothering to hide his smirk. "Though I suppose we shouldn't expect too much from someone who spent more time in front of C-SPAN cameras than in actual courtrooms." A ripple of discomfort passed through the gallery. Several veteran court reporters exchanged glances. Whitman's hostility was palpable and premature, even by his notoriously harsh standards. The defense team, led by silver-tongued corporate litigator Marcus Sterling, barely concealed their satisfaction. Sterling, a man who'd built his reputation defending media giants, allowed himself a slight smile as he adjusted his gold cufflinks. "Your Honor," Crockett replied, her tone remaining professionally neutral despite the provocation. "I assure the court that my presence here is solely motivated by my commitment to justice and my client's rights." "Rights," Whitman repeated, drawing out the word mockingly. "Yes, I'm sure you're quite the expert on rights, Miss Crockett. Though I wonder if your expertise extends beyond sound bites and actually encompasses substantive legal doctrine." At the plaintiff's table, Whoopi Goldberg's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd seen this play before. The dismissive tone, the barely veiled contempt, the assumption that Crockett's achievements were somehow less legitimate because of who she was. For the next 30 minutes, Judge Whitman maintained his hostile demeanor, peppering Crockett with interruptions and dismissive comments. When she attempted to present her opening arguments, he cut her off repeatedly. "Ms. Crockett, surely even in Texas they teach proper procedure," he interjected when she cited a precedent. "That case has limited applicability here. With respect, Your Honor, if you'll allow me to complete my argument, I believe the connection will become clear," Crockett responded, maintaining her composure. "I'll be the judge of what becomes clear in my courtroom," Whitman shot back, prompting uncomfortable shifting in the jury box. Throughout the barrage, Crockett demonstrated remarkable restraint. Those who knew her from her fierce congressional hearings might have expected fireworks, but instead, she absorbed each slight with professional grace, methodically building her case despite the obstacles Whitman threw in her path. Her legal pad filled with neat, precise notes, not the frantic scribbling of someone overwhelmed, but the careful documentation of someone playing a longer game. Her co-counsel, a young associate named David Park, occasionally slid documents to her, which she incorporated seamlessly into her presentation. When Sterling rose to present the defense's position, the contrast in Whitman's demeanor was stark. "Mr. Sterling, always a pleasure to have you in my courtroom. Please, proceed with your arguments." Sterling launched into a polished presentation, and Whitman nodded approvingly, allowing him to speak uninterrupted for nearly 15 minutes. When Crockett attempted to object to a clearly prejudicial statement, Whitman waved her off dismissively. "Ms. Crockett, please don't interrupt opposing counsel. I'm sure they teach basic courtroom etiquette even in, or was it you practiced? Texas." The disdain in his voice was unmistakable. Several jurors visibly winced at the judge's tone. A young woman in the back row of the jury box was frowning deeply, clearly troubled by the disparate treatment she was witnessing. As the morning session progressed, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Whitman sustained nearly every defense objection while overruling Crockett's, often without allowing her to fully state her grounds. He permitted Sterling to introduce exhibits with minimal foundation while subjecting Crockett's evidence to exhaustive scrutiny. "Ms. Crockett, is this really the best evidence you can present?" Whitman asked, holding up a document between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "I've seen more compelling arguments in first-year law school moot courts." Sterling and his team exchanged smug glances. One associate actually chuckled audibly, earning a sharp look from a court officer who recognized the breach of decorum. But those paying close attention might have noticed something else. Crockett wasn't just enduring the abuse, she was documenting it. Every interruption, every disparaging comment, every procedural irregularity was being carefully noted. Her co-counsel was discreetly recording timestamps, creating a meticulous record of judicial bias. Moreover, there was something in Crockett's eyes, not defeat or frustration, but a keen intelligence that suggested she was several moves ahead in a game Whitman didn't even realize he was playing. In the gallery, a woman in a charcoal suit sat in the back row, her press credentials identifying her as a legal correspondent for a major network. But those credentials didn't mention her other role, as a former clerk for the Second Circuit Court of Appeals who maintained close ties to the Judicial Oversight Committee. She, too, was taking careful notes, her expression growing more concerned with each display of bias. As the morning session neared its end, Whitman looked down at Crockett over his wire-rimmed glasses. "We'll break for lunch. Ms. Crockett, I suggest you use the time to reconsider your approach. At this rate, I may have to consider sanctions for wasting the court's time." "Thank you, Your Honor," Crockett replied evenly. "I look forward to presenting additional evidence this afternoon that I believe the court will find illuminating." Something in her tone made Whitman pause briefly, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "We shall see, counselor. We shall see." As the judge retired to his chambers, Crockett turned to Whoopi Goldberg and whispered something that made the veteran actress's eyes widen slightly before a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. In the hallway outside, Sterling was holding court with reporters, his confidence evident. "Judge Whitman runs a tight ship," he told them. "He doesn't tolerate grandstanding or political theater in his courtroom." Meanwhile, Crockett and her team huddled in a small conference room, where David Park was pulling files from a locked briefcase that hadn't been present during the morning session. The documents bore stamps and markings that suggested they came from sources far beyond the usual discovery process. When court reconvened after lunch, there was a subtle but distinct change in the atmosphere. The gallery had swelled during the break, with several new faces in attendance, including two individuals whose bearing and positioning suggested federal law enforcement. Crockett had also been joined at counsel table by a distinguished older woman whom court regulars recognized as Margaret Shun, a legendary appellate attorney who rarely appeared in trial courts. Judge Whitman returned to the bench with the same imperious bearing, but something in Crockett's posture, straighter, more confident, should have warned him that the afternoon would be different. "Ms. Crockett, you may continue with your case," Whitman said, his tone suggesting he expected more of the same fumbling he'd imagined he'd witnessed that morning. "Thank you, Your Honor." Crockett rose, smoothing her blazer. "Before I proceed with our evidence regarding the defamation claim, I need to address a preliminary matter that has come to light during the lunch recess." Whitman's eyes narrowed. Preliminary matter? Ms. Crockett, we have a schedule to maintain. I understand, Your Honor. However, this matter directly impacts the integrity of these proceedings. She nodded to David Park, who approached the bench with a sealed folder. I'm requesting permission to approach and present this to the court in camera. Sterling shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Whatever this is, it's clearly an ambush tactic. I'm inclined to agree, Whitman began, but Crockett interrupted, something she had strategically avoided all morning. Your Honor, Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 60(b)(3) requires the court to consider evidence of fraud, misrepresentation, or misconduct by an opposing party. What I have to present goes beyond that. It concerns the integrity of the judicial process itself. The formal citation and her suddenly steel-edged tone made Whitman pause. The gallery leaned forward collectively, sensing a shift in the proceedings. You have 2 minutes, Counselor, Whitman said grudgingly. Crockett and Margaret Chun approached the bench, along with Sterling. At the sidebar, Crockett's voice was low but carried just enough for the court reporter to capture every word. Your Honor, during the lunch recess, my team was contacted by the Judicial Ethics Committee regarding a formal complaint filed by 7 different attorneys who have appeared before you in the last 6 months. Whitman's face flushed. This is highly inappropriate. Additionally, Crockett continued smoothly. We've discovered that your financial disclosure forms for the past 3 years contain significant omissions, particularly regarding your wife's ownership stake in Meridian Media Holdings, the parent company of the defendant in this case. Sterling's face went pale. Your Honor, I had no knowledge. I'm not finished, Crockett said, her voice carrying the same authority she wielded in congressional hearings. We also have evidence that Your Honor has had ex parte communications with defense counsel's firm on at least 4 occasions in the past month, including a dinner at the Harvard Club just last Tuesday. She produced a photograph from the folder, a clear image of Whitman and Sterling's senior partner sharing what appeared to be an intimate dinner conversation. This is outrageous, Whitman sputtered, but his voice had lost its commanding tone. What's outrageous, Your Honor, is that my client's right to an impartial tribunal has been compromised from the moment we walked in here, Crockett replied. Now, we can handle this quietly with your voluntary recusal, or I can make these documents part of the public record. Back at counsel table, Whoopi Goldberg watched the sidebar conference with keen interest. The defense team's second chair was frantically texting, likely alerting senior partners to the unfolding disaster. When the sidebar broke up, Whitman's transformation was visible to everyone in the courtroom. His ruddy complexion had faded to an unhealthy pallor, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice lacking its earlier authority. It has come to my attention that there may be an appearance of impropriety regarding my ability to preside over this case impartially. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters began typing furiously on their phones and laptops. Your Honor, Crockett said, now standing at counsel table with perfect posture. For the record, I would like to note that the plaintiff is prepared to present evidence of systematic bias, including audio recordings of this morning's proceedings that demonstrate a clear pattern of prejudicial treatment. She held up a small digital device. Every interruption, every disparaging comment, every instance of differential treatment between counsel has been documented. We counted 47 interruptions of plaintiff's counsel versus 0 for the defense, 23 sustained objections for the defense versus only 2 for the plaintiff, and approximately 15 minutes of additional speaking time granted to Mr. Sterling. Margaret Chun stood beside her. Your Honor, I've reviewed the transcript in real time. In my 40 years of practice, I've rarely seen such a clear-cut case for appellate reversal based on judicial bias. Whitman seemed to shrink into his robes. The man who had entered the courtroom that morning like an emperor now looked like what he was, a biased judge whose prejudices had been exposed for all to see. Furthermore, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength, we've discovered that this is not an isolated incident. Your Honor has demonstrated a pattern of bias against female attorneys of color in your courtroom. We have affidavits from 11 attorneys, all documenting similar treatment. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Your Honor's financial connections to the defendant, combined with the documented bias demonstrated today, leave us no choice but to file an immediate motion for recusal under 28 U.S.C. Section 455. We're also forwarding our findings to the Second Circuit Judicial Council for investigation. Sterling rose weakly. Your Honor, the defense was unaware of any financial connections. Save it, Mr. Sterling, Whitman said bitterly. Ms. Crockett has made her point. He looked around the courtroom, at the reporters capturing every moment, at the federal observers who had materialized during lunch, at the jury watching with rapt attention. This court will. I will be filing a voluntary recusal from this case. That's not sufficient, Your Honor, Crockett said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her congressional authority. We're requesting that all of your cases involving corporate media defendants be reviewed for similar conflicts. My congressional office, will be requesting a full investigation into judicial bias in the Southern District. The two federal observers in the gallery exchanged meaningful glances. One discreetly spoke into his sleeve, likely alerting others to what was unfolding. You've made your point, Counselor, Whitman said, his voice barely above a whisper. Have I, Your Honor? Crockett asked. Because from where I stand, the point is that justice should be blind, not selectively blind based on the demographics of the attorney or the financial interests of the judge. She turned to address the gallery, knowing her words would be broadcast across the nation within hours. Today's proceedings demonstrate why diversity in our legal system matters. When judges feel empowered to treat attorneys differently based on their race, gender, or background, it's not just the attorney who suffers, it's the entire system of justice. Whitman's gavel lay unused on his bench, a symbol of authority he could no longer credibly wield. This court stands in recess pending reassignment to another judge, he said weakly, then fled to his chambers without the usual formal exit. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed toward Crockett, who stood calmly beside Whoopi Goldberg, her composure intact despite the morning of abuse she'd endured. Sterling and his team hurriedly packed their materials, fleeing through a side exit to avoid the media storm. Ms. Crockett, did you plan this from the beginning? A reporter shouted. Crockett's response was measured but pointed. I came here to seek justice for my client. What we exposed was a system that sometimes fails to provide that justice fairly. The evidence speaks for itself. Whoopi Goldberg stood beside her attorney, her expression one of profound pride. This is why I asked Jasmine to represent me, she told the gathering press. She doesn't just fight for justice, she embodies it. As they made their way through the crowd, Margaret Chen leaned close to Crockett. Brilliant strategy. You let him hang himself with his own bias while building an airtight record for judicial misconduct. Sometimes, Crockett replied quietly, the best way to expose injustice is to let it reveal itself fully before striking back. 2 hours later, news broke that Judge Harold Whitman had submitted a letter to the chief judge requesting a temporary leave of absence, pending an ethics investigation. The Second Circuit announced a comprehensive review of all his cases involving media defendants over the past 5 years. In her hotel suite that evening, Jasmine Crockett sat with Whoopi Goldberg, both women reflecting on the day's events. You know they'll come after you for this, Whoopi said gently. Whitman has powerful friends. Crockett smiled, the same smile she wore when facing down hostile witnesses in congressional hearings. Let them come. Today proved something important. That bullies in black robes are still just bullies. And bullies always underestimate those they try to intimidate. She pulled up an email on her phone from the Judicial Ethics Committee, requesting her full cooperation with their investigation. Besides, I've got 47 interruptions and 15 minutes of stolen time documented. If they want to fight, they'll get one conducted entirely by the rules. Rules Judge Whitman forgot apply to him too. The next morning's headlines screamed the story across the nation. Congressional representative exposes judicial bias in stunning courtroom reversal. Legal experts would debate the implications for months. But in that moment, in that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett had proven that sometimes the best response to bias isn't anger or retreat. It's brilliant, methodical, and devastating legal strategy. The case would eventually be reassigned to a different judge and settled favorably for Whoopi Goldberg. But the real victory had already been won. In exposing a system that sometimes forgot its own principles, and in demonstrating that those who stand up to injustice, armed with intelligence and preparation, can bring even the most powerful to accountability. Judge Harold Whitman's career would never recover from that Thursday morning when he walked into court ready to humiliate an attorney he'd prejudged, only to have his own prejudices become his downfall. It was a reminder that in the halls of justice, hubris is often the prelude to humiliation, and that true legal genius lies not in domination, but in the patient, strategic pursuit of truth.